They tried to silence him, beat him, threatened him. But Charles Caldwell? He refused to kneel. This is the man they couldn't break, and the truth they never told you. There are men who live ordinary lives. And then there are men who change history, even if the world never writes their names down. Charles Caldwell was one of those men. He wasn't born free. He was born property, a child of Mississippi, but chained to a world that didn't even see him as human. Before he ever knew what it felt like to dream, he knew what it meant to obey. Before he ever learned the sound of freedom, he learned the crack of the whip. From the moment he opened his eyes, the world told him, "You are less." But something inside Charles refused to believe that. Even as a boy, he carried a fire in his chest, quiet, steady, and dangerous for a world built on silence. He watched, he listened, and he remembered. Every command, every injustice, every cruel laugh from the men who owned his life. He remembered it all, because deep down, Charles knew something they didn't, that the day would come when those chains would break. When freedom finally came after the Civil War, it wasn't the happy ending everyone imagined. Freedom came with no roadmap, no safety, no guarantees, just fear, hunger, and the question every freed person asked themselves: what now? Many left the land that had once enslaved them, hoping to find safety somewhere else. But not Charles. He stayed. He didn't run for Mississippi. He faced it. He believed that real change didn't come from escape. It came from standing your ground, even when the ground itself hates you. So he began to speak, at first quietly, to the men and women around him, teaching, organizing, believing that the promise of America had to mean something. He taught others to read, to vote, to believe that their voices mattered, even when everyone told them they didn't. Word spread fast about the tall, strong man from Hinds County who spoke like a preacher and stood like a soldier. The same people who once called him a slave now called him trouble. But others called him something far greater, leader. And soon, Charles Caldwell did something no one ever thought possible. He ran for public office. Not as a symbol, not as a token, but as a man of conviction. And the people, both black and a few brave white allies, stood behind him. In the chaos of Reconstruction, he rose through the ranks and became one of the first black senators in Mississippi's history. Think about that. A man who once couldn't legally say no to a white man now stood in the state senate, writing laws, debating policies, defending the very freedom he'd once been denied. But his success came with a cost. Every victory made him a bigger target. Every speech he gave echoed like thunder in a sky that wasn't ready for his kind of storm. White supremacists whispered his name like a curse. They called him too proud, too bold, too dangerous. But Charles wasn't afraid. He'd already seen the worst of humanity and survived it. He believed that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing tall despite it. He met violence with dignity and hate with reason. He sat across from men who had once owned slaves, men who'd killed to keep their power, and he told them to their faces, "We built this land too, and we're not leaving it." Every word he spoke carried the weight of generations behind it. Every time he walked into that Senate chamber, the ghosts of the enslaved walked with him, silent but proud. But the more power he gained, the more the night began to whisper his name. Mississippi was changing, but not everyone wanted it to. The same men who once wore badges now wore hoods. And their message was simple: stop or die. Charles didn't stop. He knew the risk. He knew that every speech, every meeting, every vote could be his last. But when others bowed down, he stood taller. He believed that freedom was worth dying for, because living without it wasn't life at all. Then came that cold December night in 1875. Caldwell had been warned not to attend a peace meeting called by white leaders in Clinton. He went anyway. He always did. They said it was about reconciliation. It wasn't. It was a trap. When he stepped into that hall, he was surrounded. Gunfire erupted. The crowd scattered. He was shot, once in the chest. He fell to the ground, bleeding, but still alive. Witnesses say he looked up at his attackers, men he knew by name, and smiled. Then, with blood on his lips, he said his final words: "If you live long enough, you'll see justice done." Moments later, Charles Caldwell took his last breath. But he didn't die begging. He died standing, the same way he had lived. They buried him quietly, hoping his memory would fade. But history has a way of whispering the truth through time. Charles Caldwell's story didn't end in that dark street. It lived on in every man and woman who dared to rise after him, in every black voter who stood in line despite fear, in every young leader who learned that courage isn't born, it's forged in fire. Because Charles Caldwell wasn't just a man. He was proof that no system, no power, no hatred can ever break a soul built on purpose. They tried to silence him. They tried to erase him. But the man they couldn't break still speaks through every heart that refuses to kneel. They called him dangerous. They said he was too bold, too loud, too unafraid. But what they really meant was he couldn't be controlled. Charles Caldwell didn't carry a gun. He didn't march with soldiers. He didn't hide behind armies or titles. His weapon was his voice. And in those dark, uncertain years after the Civil War, that voice carried farther than bullets ever could. When he stood to speak, the room changed. Men who once commanded slaves now sat across from him, uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, pretending not to listen, but unable to look away. Because Caldwell didn't speak with hate. He spoke with truth. And truth has a sound no man can silence. He would walk into the Mississippi State Senate, not as a servant, not as a survivor, but as an equal. His presence alone was defiance. Every step he took down those marble floors was a reminder of how far he'd come, and how much they feared what he represented. They whispered, "He's too proud. He doesn't know his place. He's dangerous." But Charles didn't care about their comfort. He cared about his people's justice. He spoke for the sharecroppers still trapped by debt, for the mothers who buried sons in unmarked graves, for the children growing up under a sky that promised freedom but delivered fear. And when he spoke, his voice didn't tremble. It roared. It echoed. It cut through the silence of centuries. "You cannot build a new nation," he said, "while still worshiping the ghosts of the old one." Some called it blasphemy. Others called it bravery. But to Charles, it was simply truth. In one famous speech, he stood before a crowd of both black and white citizens and held up a Bible. His hands were rough, the same hands that once picked cotton under the sun, but they didn't shake. He raised that Bible high and said, "This book taught you that all men are created equal. If you believe that, then stand with me. If you don't, then stop pretending you do." The crowd went silent. Even his enemies couldn't deny the fire in his words. Charles didn't fight with violence. He fought with conviction. When threats came, and they came often, he didn't hide. They sent letters. They sent warnings. They sent men to talk some sense into him. But Charles always met them face to face. There's a story that one night, a group of armed men surrounded his home. They shouted for him to come out, told him this was his last warning. Charles opened his door calm, fearless, and stood in the frame with his Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. He looked them dead in the eye and said, "If you came to talk, I'll listen. If you came to kill, I'm ready." The men froze. They weren't expecting courage. They were expecting fear. And for a moment, even they saw it, the unbreakable spirit standing before them. Then slowly, one by one, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. That was Charles Caldwell's kind of fight. Not for power, not for fame, but for principle. He knew that freedom meant nothing if people were too scared to use it. So he taught others to stand up, to vote, to speak, to believe that no man, no law, no threat could take away what God himself had promised them. And that's what made him truly dangerous. Because power doesn't fear the weak. It fears the awakened. And Charles Caldwell was awakening a generation. He organized meetings across Mississippi, in churches, in barns, under trees, anywhere people could gather. He'd preach about rights, about courage, about dignity. He'd tell them, if they burn your home, rebuild it. If they curse your name, wear it with pride. Because freedom is worth the fight. Every meeting grew larger, every crowd more inspired, and every new voice that rose beside his made his enemies more desperate. To the white supremacists of the time, Caldwell wasn't just a man, he was a threat to their entire world. He represented education where they wanted ignorance, unity where they wanted division, hope where they wanted despair. And yet, no matter how many times they tried to scare him, he refused to bend. He had seen too much pain to go back to silence. One day, during a tense Senate session, a political opponent sneered at him and said, "You talk like you own this state." Caldwell smiled and replied, "No, sir. I just talk like I belong here." The chamber went still, because that was the truth they couldn't stand, that he did belong there, that every word he spoke carried the authority of a man who had earned his place through blood, sweat, and centuries of struggle. Charles Caldwell's fight wasn't just against men. It was against a system built to crush him, a system that told him to be grateful for crumbs while he demanded a seat at the table. And even as the threats grew louder, even as the mob gathered closer, Charles never stopped fighting, because deep down, he understood something powerful. They could take his position, they could take his life, but they could never take his voice. And that voice, the one that once shook the walls of power, still echoes through history. It's in every protester who stands when told to sit, every teacher who speaks truth in a system built on lies, every young black man who dares to dream in a world that tries to cage him. That is Charles Caldwell's fight. That is his legacy. He wasn't dangerous because he held a weapon. He was dangerous because he held faith. Because in one hand he carried the Bible, and in the other, unshakable courage. And when the world demanded silence, Charles Caldwell answered, with thunder. The winter of 1875 had settled over Mississippi like a warning. The air was sharp enough to cut through bone. The nights were long and too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the soul uneasy. Charles Caldwell knew what that silence meant. He had felt it before, the calm that comes before violence. For months, whispers had circled his name in taverns and on street corners. There were lists, his name among them, of men the old powers wanted gone before the year was out. But Charles kept walking the same roads, shaking the same hands, preaching the same courage. He told his friends, "Fear is how they win. I will not give them that victory." Still, even courage feels the cold. On the evening of December 30th, the sky above Clinton was bruised purple. Caldwell sat near a fire, the faint glow tracing the scars on his hands. A neighbor rode up fast, breath steaming in the air. He said white leaders were calling a peace meeting at the local courthouse, a meeting to calm tensions after months of bloodshed. They wanted Caldwell there. Friends begged him not to go. "Charles," one said, "you know what this is. They mean to trap you." He looked up, eyes steady. "If I don't show, they'll call me a coward. If I go, maybe someone will finally listen." Then he reached for his coat, tucked his worn Bible inside the inner pocket, and stepped into the night. The courthouse stood like a shadow in the moonlight, wooden steps, frosted windows, voices murmuring inside. As Caldwell walked up, the wind died. Every sound seemed to hold its breath. He entered the hall. Men who once called him Senator Caldwell barely nodded. Some smirked. Others wouldn't meet his gaze. They spoke of peace, of understanding, of moving forward. But their eyes told the truth, hatred disguised as civility. Caldwell listened, arms folded. When his turn came, he rose slowly. His voice, calm but firm, filled the room. "Peace is not the absence of gunfire," he said. "It is the presence of justice. Until every man can walk these streets without fear, your peace is only a pause." A few heads dropped. A few fists clenched. The meeting ended in forced smiles and empty words. Outside, the wind had returned, colder now, sharper. Caldwell pulled his collar tight and started toward home. He didn't make it far. Halfway down the dark road, figures emerged from the trees, shapes cut out of the night, rifles glinting in the faint moonlight. He stopped. There were too many to count. No lawmen, no witnesses, only silence and the soft crunch of boots on frozen dirt. One voice called out from the dark, "You've spoken enough, Caldwell." He knew that voice. He had debated with that man in the Senate only months before. Charles straightened his back. His breath clouded in front of him, but his eyes were clear. "If you think killing me will stop what's coming," he said, "then you've already lost." A shot rang out, sharp, echoing through the trees. He staggered backward, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. The Bible inside his coat caught part of the bullet, but not enough. He fell to one knee, breath short, but still alive. The men moved closer. No one spoke now. The crackle of a dying fire somewhere in town was the only sound. Caldwell looked up at them. men he had once tried to reason with, men who'd shaken his hand in daylight and hunted him in darkness. He didn't beg. He didn't curse. He simply said, through shallow breaths, "If you live long enough, you'll see justice done." Those words landed heavier than any bullet. Even the killers hesitated. Another shot fired, final, brutal. Charles Caldwell fell forward into the dust. The wind carried away the smoke, the echo, the evidence. They left him there, the snow beginning to fall, covering the blood of a man who refused to bend. By dawn, the town whispered the news like a secret. Senator Caldwell is dead. His friends found him still clutching that Bible, its pages torn and darkened with blood. Inside, the bullet had stopped on a verse from the book of Isaiah. "No weapon formed against thee shall prosper." It felt less like irony and more like prophecy. The killers were never punished. No jury was called. No trial ever came. The state moved on, pretending nothing had happened. But the people didn't forget. In church houses, they spoke his name in prayer. In classrooms generations later, teachers would whisper his story to students who had never heard it in their textbooks. Each time they said his name, it was an act of rebellion, proof that memory itself can be a form of justice. In the years that followed, Mississippi buried many truths beneath silence. But some truths grow roots. And the story of Charles Caldwell, the man who faced death standing tall, refused to die. He had told them he wouldn't beg. He hadn't. He had told them they would one day see justice. And though it came late, it came. Through every march, every vote, every voice that rose where his once echoed. They ambushed him. Shot him once. He fell, but he didn't beg. He looked his killers in the eyes and said, "If you live long enough, you'll see justice done." Then he took his final breath. Not on his knees, not in fear, but standing tall, the way only the unbreakable can. They thought his death would silence him, that the bullet which ended his life would also end his story. They believed that if they buried his body, they could bury his voice. But they were wrong, because voices like Charles Caldwell's do not die. They become echoes that time itself cannot erase. After that winter night in 1875, the men who killed him faded into the shadows. Their names slipped away, forgotten by the very world they tried to protect. But his name remained, spoken softly in homes, whispered in church halls, passed from parent to child as both warning and inspiration. The story of the man they couldn't break traveled quietly through generations. They said he died for freedom. But those who truly understood knew the truth. He lived for it. He lived every day with the weight of history pressing on his shoulders, and he carried it with grace. His strength was not in the force of his hands, but in the fire of his spirit. That fire did not go out. It moved from heart to heart, from one generation to the next. In the decades that followed, Mississippi changed its face, but not its memory. The fields where slaves once bent their backs grew silent, but under that soil, stories like his remained alive. Men and women who had never met Charles Caldwell spoke his name as if they had known him all their lives. He had become more than a man. He was an idea, a living reminder that courage has a price, but fear costs more. When the civil rights marches began nearly a century later, his presence could be felt in the crowds. He was there in every young protester who refused to move. He was there in every mother who faced down hate and said, "My children will walk free." He was there in every preacher who cried out for justice from the pulpit, knowing the risk that came with every word. Each chant, each prayer, each step toward equality carried a piece of his voice. He once said that those who lived long enough would see justice done. And though it took years of struggle, blood, and sacrifice, that justice began to bloom. It was slow, imperfect, fragile, but it came. It came in every law changed, in every barrier broken, in every person who looked fear in the face and chose to keep walking. Historians wrote little about him. Textbooks barely mentioned his name. But the people remembered, because memory is not written in ink, it is carved into the soul. And for those who carry the story of Charles Caldwell, it is more than history, it is inheritance. He was proof that power cannot erase truth. Proof that a single voice, armed only with conviction, can shake the walls of an empire built on injustice. He was proof that even in death, dignity can live forever. Many men in history are remembered for conquering others. Caldwell is remembered for conquering himself, his fear, his anger, his pain. He chose principle over comfort, courage over safety, and faith over hatred. He showed that leadership is not measured by how loudly a man commands, but by how deeply he believes. Real strength is quiet. It does not need to shout. It stands, even when standing means standing alone. That was his gift to those who came after him, the lesson that strength is not born from muscle or might, but from moral fire. When the night feels too long, when injustice feels endless, people still draw on his story. They remember the man who faced an army with nothing but his faith. The man who stared into the eyes of his killers and left them with a prophecy instead of fear. The man who lost his life, but never his soul. Because the truth is, they never killed Charles Caldwell. They only freed his spirit. And that spirit found its way into every place where courage is needed. It lives in the voice of a teacher who refuses to stay silent about truth. It lives in the steps of a young man who votes for the first time, knowing what others endured for that right. It lives in the hearts of people who still rise, again and again, no matter how heavy the world becomes. He taught us that immortality isn't about statues or holidays or written praise. It's about the fire you leave burning behind you. It's about the people who carry your light when your body is gone. That is how legends are made. Not in glory, but in endurance. Charles Caldwell's grave may rest in quiet Mississippi soil, but his story walks free. It walks every time justice stands where hate once ruled. It breathes in every act of truth, every spark of defiance, every moment when someone refuses to surrender. That is his true memorial, the living proof that courage cannot be killed. They thought his death would erase his voice, but it only made him immortal. Because real strength isn't about how hard you hit, how loud you shout, or how many follow your name. Real strength is about never letting the world break your soul. And that is why, long after his killers were forgotten, Charles Caldwell still stands. Not in bronze or stone, but in spirit, unbroken, unbowed, eternal. Charles Caldwell's story isn't just history. It's a reminder that no matter how dark the times, courage will always rise. If his story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe, tap like, and share this so more people know the man they couldn't break. Because heroes like him deserve to be remembered.